I do think we can build things into meetings and agendas and processes that not only allow space for curiosity and discussion, but actively try to foster it.
One of the most important contributions of a pre-mortem is to help create a culture of candor in a team where people aren't afraid to say things that might be unpopular.
What I also try to do in organizations is to normalize it, to talk about things going wrong, because things do go wrong. And that's fine. It's realistic. I love the word realism at work. Things go wrong. We look at it. We learn from it.
If you just assume that you're in a meeting and the point of the meeting is to come up with the best solution and then deploy it, that is a different mentality from saying, we don't fully know, and we know that details matter, so we're going to try a few different things and test them. That requires some openness to the idea that you don't know.
The bottom line here is what really matters. It's not the data that matters, it's the narrative that matters. As a leader, it actually doesn't matter so much what you think went wrong and went right. What matters is the story that your people are telling themselves tomorrow about the team, themselves, and you.
This is Banknotes, Banking Culture Reform. The views expressed in this podcast do not represent those of the New York Fed or the Federal Reserve System.
Hello, and welcome to Season 3 of the Banking Culture Podcast, part of the New York Fed's initiative to drive awareness and change in financial services culture. This season, we'll speak with experts on how organizations can build curiosity and learning mindsets into their cultures. We'll explore tools that are immediately useful in the information that they uncover, but at a deeper level, their repeated use can create a culture that treats mistakes as opportunities for improvement versus moments that instill fear. My name is Tony DiCario, and I'm with the New York Fed's culture team. Today, we're joined by Wieke Scholten from BR Insights. Welcome, Wieke.
Hi, Tony.
Wieke, could you start off by briefly introducing yourself for those that aren't already familiar with your work?
Yeah, of course. Thanks. I'm Wieke Scholten. I'm a social and organizational psychologist, and I work in behavioral risk management in financial services. So, which is a bit of a new field, I guess, in a upcoming field where you look at current behaviors in an organization to prevent future problems. I have my own practice in behavioral risk called BR Insights, based in the Netherlands, but working globally. Yeah.
Wonderful. Thanks, Wieke. This season, we're talking about how to use intertemporal thinking to build curiosity about our own behaviors and decisions. My first question for you is, why should we care? Why should organizational leaders focus on creating a learning and curiosity-based culture at all?
Well, I would think there's actually at least two reasons. One that we know is that if you create a learning culture that improves your performance, which I guess is a really good reason to look into that. Innovation, it helps with your agility of your organization, but it also prevents problems and future issues. And that's really the work that I'm often concerned with is in risk management or behavioral risk management. So there we know that a learning culture helps you to prevent future problems. And who wouldn't want that, right?
Right. Specifically, you've done a lot of work on error management and how organizations handle errors, what perceptions are like about errors within organizations. Can you talk a little bit about why it's important to have an open approach to errors specifically, and how the attitudes towards errors impact outcomes?
Yeah, I think there's just... So I'm an organizational social psychologist, and from a behavioral science perspective, it's very clear there's lots of experimental research that shows if you have an open response to errors, that helps your performance and prevents those issues. So not so much what I encounter sometimes in organizations is also the thinking that it's more comfortable or that we create an open environment because we feel better when we can talk about problems openly. You don't have to be worried about consequences or shame. And yes, it's more comfortable, but more important, it actually helps your performance and helps prevent those problems. And for that, you need to have a structured look at what went wrong.
I want to talk to you a little bit about terminology. I think that you're pretty specific about the terminology that you use. Can you describe what terms you use and why you use those terms?
Actually, when you look at that psychological theory that I just referred to, their error management approaches is often used in terms of terminology, referring to learning from things that went wrong. So that's also the academic literature I use in my work in financial services. However, when I use the word error in our industry, often it's associated with operational errors, for instance. So it's more about operational risk or operational errors. Whilst I think it's really important and interesting to discuss things going wrong more widely. So this could be about somebody making a mistake. Yes, it could also be an operational error, but it could also be a decision that you made that turned out differently than you thought up front. So, to really make that wide definition, I always make sure that I explain a little bit when I talk about things going wrong. It entails all of that. That Professor Amy Edmondson, who is very known for her psychological safety work, just published a book about this as well. Um, so how to learn from mistakes, but she actually distinguishes mistakes from discoveries, which I think is very interesting. So she says when it's unknown territories or and there's no knowledge yet, we better call it discoveries and not so much mistakes. Because then if you don't know, when there's no knowledge yet on what to do, how can it then be a mistake? So I think that's also where she tries to, let's say, experiment with different terminologies to make it more comfortable for people to talk about things that go wrong at work. So yeah. I think terminology in that sense is really important to make it more comfortable and more safer for people to discuss it.
That idea of treating something as a discovery also seems to reduce stigma, I would think, around something that's gone wrong. I guess not only reduce stigma, but turn it on its head and turn it into a positive.
Exactly. Yeah. And yes, turning it into a positive because you want to look at the opportunity almost, that the thing that went wrong also offers in terms of looking forward. What I also try to do in organizations is to make it normalize it almost to talk about things going wrong because things do go wrong, and that's fine. Like it's realistic. I love the word realism at work. Things go wrong. We look at it. We learn from it. But we do actively learn from it instead of just fixing it and moving on. Yeah. And another thing I think on terminology, which um, I think is important, is that how we deal with things going wrong at work is rarely the same within an organization. So when we look at learning culture, we just referred to, um, I think it's important to acknowledge that learning culture differs per subculture. And that has to do with one of the basic principles in social psychology is that we're social creatures. And even though we think we are individual and rational thinkers, we often think and act primarily as group members. So those groups at work, so that's about the teams we're in, the areas we work in, the divisions, departments, the groups we identify with at work are often very local. And what we know is from research and practice is that how we deal with things going wrong at work also differs per area. So that means it's really difficult to say we have a learning culture in our organization. It is really about finding out sometimes what helps and hinders us to learn from things going wrong in those, let's say, pockets, those local climates or subcultures, we like to say. And I think that matters because if you want to then create a learning culture, you have to first have a bit of a local view to know how to do that.
hmm And how would you describe kind of different subcultural approaches to mistakes?
So I strongly rely on what we know from experimental research as well. And in the Netherlands, there's a group of researchers at VU University, for instance, who have done quite some research on this. And they think in 4 approaches, really, that you can distinguish when you look at a group of people in how do they deal with things going wrong, how do they respond to that. And those 4 ways can be plotted on 2 axes. One is the extent to which things that go wrong are acknowledged or accepted as part of professional reality. And so is that acknowledged that things go wrong at work, or is it forbidden? The other axe is around the extent to which these things going wrong are responded to actively. So do you sit back or do you take action? So going to those 4 approaches and where teams differ in, 3 of them actually we know do not lead to better outcomes, organizational outcomes in terms of performance or mitigating risk, right? The risk of poor outcomes occurring. So those 3 that are not effective, one is ignore and deny, sometimes called or denial. So there is a low acknowledgement. So it's very much we ignore that it's there. We don't discuss it. It's not part of we don't talk about it. So it's not part of our reality at work. Hence, also the, let's say, adverse implication in terms of conduct is that if you don't discuss things that go wrong, you can't learn from it. So that's quite easy to understand, the denial approach. Mm-hmm. Second, you can also have a team where it is, again, a low acceptance, but paired with an taking action instead of sitting back. So that's not a denial, but more a blame and punish approach, you would say. And for that, we also know that the conduct implications are, by the way, universal. This happens globally. These are very well-researched behavioral impact of when you respond, for instance, as a leader or as a colleague, to something that goes wrong at work with blame, that people tend to cover up their actions as a consequence. So there's less visibility of things going wrong. And from a learning perspective, that is obviously not good news. It drives a higher risk of poor outcomes. You can't see it, you can't pick up on it. But also from an innovation and performance perspective, people will not, will be more reticent to try new things. Uh-huh. And the third, let's say, approach to watch out for is the approach where a high acceptance is paired with sitting back. So yes, there's acknowledgement that things go wrong at work, which is a good thing, because denial and blame and punish approaches are not categorized by that. But it's paired with not doing anything. So we call that sometimes accept and justify type of approach. From a conduct implication, you could almost have, let's say, a slippery slope effect. You call that in psychology, where you are exposed to things that go wrong but are not really dealt with actively or learned from. Then we get used to those incidents, and it can also spiral out of control. So especially in unethical conduct, that could definitely be a problem. So to go to the most effective way actually to deal with things going wrong at work is then where you may have guessed it. Yeah, you combine a high acknowledgement that things go wrong at work. It happens every day. I probably messed something up already 2 times in this podcast, right? So that happens. That's what we do. We're people. But pair that with an active response. So not sitting back, but learning from it. So identify and learn. It's sometimes called, or high error management, if you take the academic term. Mm-hmm. And there's so much science showing that leads to great organizational outcomes. So it's really the smart things to do. Next to that high acknowledgement is more comfortable. It's also smart. But that means that you also have to let go. If you want that in your team, it means that you need to let go that a zero tolerance approach is effective. And I find that especially in financial services or in markets areas where I do my work, sometimes it's still fear is sometimes used to create the better outcome. So zero tolerance and really pushing towards that zero tolerance is still common. And I think there's nothing wrong with aiming to deliver to excellence. But as long as there's a realistic acknowledgement that things sometimes do not go as planned, and if that happens, that you don't respond harshly, because that does not drive performance. It actually has many adverse effects. And I think there's too much known of the negative impact of fear. And I think there was also a great academic guest on the last conference the New York Fed had organized on culture last June. So Professor Giselle Antoine of Washington University talked about her research on fear and shame, for instance. And those emotions are part also of our professional life. You have to manage that in a smart way, I think. Yeah, and it also means, of course, to then learn from mistakes actively. So you have, you could say, as for instance, a leader, making the same mistake 3 times is not accepted. So we have a high acknowledgement that things can go wrong, but that doesn't mean everything is now allowed and, we can do whatever.
Right. I love a good 2-variable graph where I can locate myself on a scatter plot. I think that more often than not, I think that low acceptance that mistakes are going to happen, as well as kind of low action on mistakes that do happen, I think that is a pretty common place to be. So if, I'm leading an organization and have identified, a subculture to be there, what do you think is the more important access to focus on first?
So I would start with acknowledgement that mistakes do happen. And even if you're then still passive about it, let's say sitting back, then turn up how you then learn from them. Yeah. I did read yesterday some research on what happens if employees do not see that you actually take action. So they have to keep, for instance, in Speak Up research, you see that a lot. For them to keep raising issues, or document, for instance, incidents, they need to believe that something is done with it. If that isn't the case, it will go down very rapidly.
Yeah. Yeah, we actually, in our first season of the Culture Podcast, spoke to Mikhail Down of the former Financial Services Culture Board, and he talked about how their research had discovered how futility. He described that as the idea of futility, and how much that drives behavior, and how much that kind of stops people from talking about things that have gone wrong. Why do firms fail to learn from things going wrong? What are some of the common hindering mechanisms that you've seen?
So, as a psychologist, I can't help answering this question from very much in a psychological way, probably. But I think the first point to make is that there are 2 basic psychological mechanisms that we all have, which is the need to belong to a group, and the need to be seen as good and successful, or to do good. We all have these, like it's part of us. And that means that I believe that owning up to something that you've done or have not done, resulting in something that was not desirable at work, could hurt the group you belong to or hurt your reputation in that group. And that is threatening. It's one of the scariest things for us as people. So it could lead to exclusion, which is a very primary fear we have, or we don't want to be excluded, right? So we are naturally wired to want to avoid exclusion or blame. And we also do not want to see ourselves as not good. And those 2 make it so difficult to own up to your mistakes. Mm-hmm. Self-justification is also very known. And so we just talked a bit about shame and defensiveness. Self-justification is a very strong tendency we all have. You hear people say this also in your personal life, right? When something goes wrong, and we often say, I did not intend to do it. And there's also a great book, I feel, called Mistakes Were Made, But Not By Me. I catch myself quoting it time and time again. It's by Tafers and Aronson, with also lots of juicy examples, also from politics, lots of examples. But it's really, going into that tendency to self-justify and all the reasons why we do that. But to counter that basic human tendency to self-justify and not own up, we have to create, I guess, in organizations, professional context that encourage people to do so anyway. So to sort of overcome that tendency. And I think that is quite difficult in organizational context where, for instance, there's a legal paradigm. So, for example, I heard a Dutch lawyer say a long time ago, by the way, but after the financial crisis, 2008, 2007, he said in a newspaper, look, as a lawyer, what you want is to contain a problem, to make it small. So you want to say, this person messed up and we fired him or her. It was a bad apple. We got rid of the person. We fixed the problem. Therewith, we fixed the problem and we continue. We have nothing to learn. That it was really the legal response to things going wrong, which is makes it more difficult to really start talking about mistakes.
I think that's a huge obstacle. And if you're kind of just blaming it on a person, then you can move forward without ever fixing the thing that really was underneath it all. So actually, since we're there, I want to talk to you about root cause analysis. I think that root cause analysis can be very difficult for organizations to really get right or get as much out of as they could. So can you talk a little bit about root cause analysis and kind of what are some common practices that characterize effective root cause analysis as a way to examine things that have gone wrong, learn from it, and get better?
I think first, just so practically what you need to do, I think, is first to decide on what occurred offense are we going to do an RCA on. Because I don't believe that everything that went wrong, you need to do an RCA on. And root cause analysis, apologies, I call that RCA, right? So I think, that you chose the wrong color of the carpet, you don't need to do an RCA on. And please don't do RCAs because you said you're going to do RCAs, because I also think that is not a good reason and probably also a waste of your time as an organization. So really decide well thought through on what occurs that justifies for us an RCA. And I would deploy this in that sense, risk-based, in terms also of what is the risk of us doing something like that again, or what is the risk of that occurring again? Will it hurt us as an organization, our customers? What is the societal impact? And in that sense, it's almost impact and likelihood analysis or assessment that can guide your decision on, should we do an RCA, yes or no? And if so, what type? So that is step one. Then step two is really to decide on what root causes to explore. Well, what I see in practice is that lots of organizations do not include a behavioral perspective. I was talking yesterday to somebody who is doing work in a retail bank, and he said, and it was about, let's say, quality of decisions that relationship managers made. And he said, we have it covered, Wieke. We don't need a behavioral perspective on this or a root cause analysis because it's really the process and it is the system. So we changed the process and we changed the system and we're fine. Or I came into a business once where they said, oh, you don't need to look here because we had bonuses, but we took them away. So there's no incentive anymore to do something that is not right. So whilst we know that bonuses or is only one element of that could drive certain behaviors. It could be one of the root causes, sure, but I think that behavioral perspective is often a blind spot, and I think so. That is really an advice I would like to give in this podcast as well. Include a behavioral perspective because everything that goes wrong in an organization also has a behavioral root cause.
And at the end of the day, I imagine, there might be a systemic or a systems, I should say, reason for particular behavior. And so at the end of the day, you may end up needing to change a system, but the behavioral analysis helps you see where kind of those behaviors are stemming from and which systems might be driving them, as opposed to going straight to some of the systems you described, as opposed to going straight to comp and thinking that that's going to resolve everything.
Exactly. I think then it's the step from, we change the process or we change the system to then the outcome will be better, always goes through people's actions. So you have to have a view of what to then change indeed in terms of the process, but also, or the system, but also the elements of that. And you could also, we call that often drivers of behaviors, right? Where you can distinguish more formal drivers, so anything on paper or anything that you can almost touch that may drive behavior. So these are systems, processes, procedures, incentives. Sometimes they are also called organizational drivers of behaviors, but you also have social drivers. So those collective beliefs, social norms, psychological safety, dynamics between teams, assumptions that people have, all of that are more social drivers of behaviors. You also have individual drivers. Think of fatigue, stress people experience, contextual drivers like market developments, the regulator. I mean, I've also worked at a regulator, so I know what type of regulatory behavior can also result into behaviors in organizations. So all of that, I think that is in terms of a good effective root cause analysis, tries to have a wide divergence in terms of what type of root causes can we think of and include behavior. So not what happens now, how do we do things here, and what aspects of how we do things here were also causing the occurred events, but are also present today and could lead to future events. Because I do think that's where the learning comes in, right? That is really what that deep dive often entails, and really resulting into these are the behavioral patterns and drivers that you can address to prevent those future issues that we can learn from, that were underlying the occurred events, but that we can also change to prevent future events. Whilst that session that I referred to in terms of a root cause analysis, that's really where you go and sit in a room. And here, what I see in the industry sometimes is that is almost done by people are involved that weren't really involved in the incident or the occurred events that you want to conduct a root cause analysis on. So you don't have the right people in the room.
Is why don't you have the right people in the room? Is it that the senior managers are all invited in as opposed to the people who are on the ground? Why do you think that happens?
Sometimes that's the case, whereas senior leadership who were involved are now too busy to, spend 2 hours of your day to really invest in learning from this. This is also where you see leaders differ greatly. There are leaders out there that really understand the value of this, right? And go in there and be there themselves. But there are also leaders who say, it's something that needs to be done. So do it for me, almost. Or people that represent areas but weren't really involved. So my advice would be to really involve those who were involved in that event. And ensure you have all of them actually in the room, preferably physically, is also my experience. Then not to take too long, like I said, and don't dwell on it, but make it action. Don't sit back, but really first, I think step one, gain a mutual understanding of the event, but then really on not so much, I think this happened, but more what happened really, factually, who was involved, what happened, from almost a timeline. Step two, then what kind of root causes can we distinguish? They're taking in those different categories that we discussed of potential root causes, so diverge, scope wide. Step three is then converge. So what are, of all those root causes, what are the ones that had the most impact and with the highest risk to cause recurrence? So those are two questions, right? Which ones had the highest impact and which ones are still here and could cause a recurrence of such an event? that is actually also almost your risk assessment of what are current root causes that are still current today. And then step 4 is then to what do we need to do to address these root causes so that recurrence is prevented, and then take those actions, really decide who's going to own these actions, follow up. That I think is really important.
One of the things you touched on was the importance of leaders really taking part in this and being active. And I'm wondering if you can expand upon that a little more from the sense of the work you've done on accountability regimes. How has the introduction of accountability regimes, in your mind, influenced the ability of leaders to kind of take ownership of things that happen under their watch, and how has it changed behaviors in your mind?
Yeah, so I think here there's really something to gain in the way we implement these regimes, right? And I think it definitely impacts the way leaders keep engaging in conversations about things going wrong. So, and I think that what we know about behavior is currently not sufficiently taken into account when implementing these regimes. So the risk is that leaders could start avoiding liability, right, by not wanting to know about what is going wrong in their organizations. And that, I think, is a real threat for performance and, again, also for risk events happening. So you want senior leaders to be curious about what is happening in that operational reality, what is happening at the call phase of my organization, not what I say at the top, but what happens in reality, that realism again, right? So you want them to be curious about that. And I think, therefore, it is important when you implement that regime. And I think regulators, again, have for instance, a role to play, but also firms, senior leaders in firms themselves to almost choose to take it that way and to have that conversation with authorities as well, to aim for a process-based application. So instead of these regimes being more outcome based. So, meaning that you ask organizations and senior leaders to evidence their efforts to prevent problems instead of asking them to evidence that nothing went wrong, because that's not realistic. There will be things that go wrong, and it will drive defensive behavior or drive a motivation of indeed not wanting to know that reality. What senior leaders need to have is a certain degree of trust that the steps they undertake to prevent problems in their organization will be fairly assessed by authorities, because that's often what these regimes say. You need to take sufficient steps or to prevent problems, but will these steps that you have taken be assessed fairly? That is really what you need to trust as a senior leader to be able to feel don't freeze up almost. So that expected fairness or expected unfairness is something in the implementation that you really need to manage. And I think what we do know from behavioral science is that expected unfairness has adverse effects on learning, sure, but can also drive rule-breaking behavior even. So it can drive incompliant behavior if you don't manage that.
We're almost out of time, so I did just want to ask you one last question, which is you've mentioned a couple of resources during the course of this conversation, and I'm hoping that you can give us the names of those resources again and any other resources, whether it's books or lectures or podcasts or things that are out there that people can refer to if they want to know more about this kind of thing.
Yeah, great. Yeah, I think, well, I mentioned indeed that book, Mistakes Were Made, but Not by Me.
I love that title.
Yeah. And the subtitle is actually Why We Justify Foolish Beliefs, Bad Decisions, and Hurtful Acts. And what I love about that book is by Tavers and Aronson on self-justification, but also really on that intention piece, right? People have the best intentions, but to learn from it, it's almost irrelevant, right? That those intentions were great. Because how can we say, and I think that's fascinating, I just did something wrong. I did something wrong and I messed up. And it doesn't really matter whether that was my intention or not. It happened.
Yeah.
And owning up to that is, I think, how do we do that as people? I think is utterly fascinating. Then The Right Kind of Wrong, The Science of Failing Well, is that new book of Amy Edmondson that I have to admit I haven't read fully yet, just partly. But I love it already. So I'm like, yes, get that one. And then lastly, the book I love most of all, I think, is called The Moral Organization. That book is written by Naomi Ellemers and Dick de Gilder. It was also published this year, like Amy's book as well. And it actually perfectly explains all of the mechanisms that we've been talking about today, from air management approaches to moral climates and concrete ways to improve them. So that would be my tip.
Thank you, Wieke. Thank you so much for all of your tips today.
Thank you, Tony.
For more conversations like this, as well as publications and other resources related to banking culture reform, please visit our website at newyorkfed.org/governance and culture reform.